Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our discussion today, titled Beyond Galas and Grants, an End to the Nonprofit Hunger Games. My name is Madeline Crow, and I'm Associate Director of Institutional Giving at the Bay Area Discovery Museum and Board Secretary for Cultural Connections. And I will be moderating our program this evening with our great panelists here. We will have time at the end of this program for questions from the audience, so please feel free to submit your questions into the chat box throughout the program. This event has been created by Cultural Connections board members. Cultural Connections is a community of Bay Area museum, arts, and cultural professionals who meet regularly to exchange ideas, share resources, and inspire creativity. We offer programs and networking events throughout the year, and we're excited to offer this as our final program for the year. As a heads up, also this program will be recorded and available later. As many of us continue to log into conversations, virtual conversations like this from all over, I wanted to mention that since Cultural Connections is based in the Bay Area, San Francisco specifically, we acknowledge that those of us in the Bay Area are on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people. And if anyone else would like to offer a land acknowledgement from where you're calling in from today, please feel free to do so in the chat. Lastly, I wanted to give a really huge thanks to my fellow Cultural Connections board members, Sal Alper and Terry Lay. This program was a collaborative effort, and I really appreciate all of your efforts. With that being said, we are going to start today with each of our panelists introducing themselves and giving some context about their work and backgrounds. Our panelists, Sue and Barbara, will then have a conversation about equity-based fundraising and funding, decentralized fundraising models, and more. We'll be opening the last 30 minutes of our program today to questions from the audience. So again, just keep saying this, but please drop your questions in the chat throughout the program and we will get to those at the end. So Sue, if you don't mind starting us off here with a brief introduction about yourself and your work. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Madeline. I'm happy to be here. This webinar mode is even odder than the usual since I can't see all the faces on the call, but I know you're there. My name's Sue Bennett. I work for an organization called the Sustainable Economies Law Center. Our mission is to provide training and education and legal support to bring about the next generation. I'm doing a bad job at my elevator speech here too, aren't I? To bring the next generation of funding to our economy. And we do that by providing legal support and training to organizations trying to have an alternative economic situation. Mostly worker co-ops, and we support nonprofit organizations in what we call a worker self-directed model. So I am not your typical museum or arts organization, but we work closely with a lot of arts organizations who want to break down the hierarchy of the typical nonprofit industrial complex and the structure of our governance in nonprofits. My background in funding and nonprofits is I've spent most of my career of the last 25 years in nonprofit organizations, both in programmatic and support roles. My title at the Law Center is Director of Operations and Miscellaneous Stuff. And so like many of you, I do a lot of miscellaneous stuff, one of which is support our grant making team, our grant seeking team. I have a background in training and consulting with nonprofits and a brief stint as a funder for a local community foundation. So that's my background.
So much, Sue. Barbara, will you introduce yourself and give a little bit of background about your work and current role?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Sue. My name is Barbara Mumby Huerta, and currently I am the Vice President of Programs and Partnerships for the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, which is headquartered in Portland. But my background for about 25 years have been in program development. The first 10 years was in the nonprofit sector, primarily in arts and culture. Then for the past 15 years, I've been working in philanthropy, the first half of which was in the social service and education sectors, overseeing grants programs for everything from drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs to early childhood education programs. Currently, the last half of that 15 years, I've been in the arts and culture sector. Prior to my role at the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, I was the director of community investments for the San Francisco Arts Commission. And through that work, I oversaw their entire grant making program, as well as their cultural center program, their street artist program, and their arts education programs. And through that, we were a national model for equity grant making. And through our model, it was replicated quite a bit throughout the sector for arts and culture equity grant making programs. I'm also a practicing artist and have done quite a bit of consulting with nonprofit organizations around sustainability, around strategic planning and program development.
Thanks so much, Barbara. We're really excited to have you both here tonight. And so we're going to start with a conversation about some of the ways both of you work on either side of the fundraising and funder sides. Sue, could you start by describing how the Sustainable Economies Law Center's decentralized fundraising model functions? Who's responsible for managing funder relationships and how that works?
Sure, I'd love to. So one of the core principles for how we operate as a worker self-directed nonprofit is that decisions should be made by the folks most affected by the decision. So at the core of that belief around fundraising is that what we call circles, a lot of folks would call departments or program folks are involved in grant seeking decisions and fundraising decisions. We have a diverse team, and we all on the grant making circle. I'm sorry, the grant seeking circle, grant circle. We come from all different parts of the organization. One of the other principles that we operate on is that everybody should have both a programmatic role and an operations role. So some folks like me may have a much more, I'd say 80% of my time is in operations roles, including fundraising. Um, but I also have a small programmatic role. And folks that are primarily program people also have a commitment to filling at least one role in which they're supporting the operations of the organization overall. Every program has a designated person who is the grants collaborator. Collaborates closely with the grant circle to seek funding for projects, either ongoing or new projects they might have an idea for. Within the grant circle itself, it's not a lot different than probably a lot of typical. We are different roles. For example, my role is as the sort of record keeper. I keep the grants management going, keeping track of dates, keeping track of applications, keeping track of payments we're expecting, that kind of thing. And we have somebody who's a designated grants writer, and different types of responsibilities, just like probably all of you. The difference between us and a typical grant circle or grant department is that regardless of our role, nobody has more influence or more decision-making power, right? So as a circle, we all have an equal say in the decisions that are made regarding fundraising. So I could say lots more, but I can I'll leave it there for the moment.
I'm curious how something we talked about a lot when we all first met and started talking about this topic was what that model looks like to funders. And so I'm curious, I'm going to open this up to both of you. You know, how do funders respond to this kind of decentralized model? Are they ever surprised when they're not talking to a development director or a grants manager and instead talking to folks throughout the organization? Is that something that you've run into, Sue and Barbara? I'm curious from a funder's perspective what that might look like.
Yeah, occasionally we still have titles, so we still have an executive director, and occasionally a funder will expect to speak with that person. But if that's the case, oftentimes there'll be a joint meeting with the executive director and the program person responsible for the ask, or the work that's being requested funding for, and it's made very clear that that relationship is being handed off to that person. I've seen it in much more traditional organizations where that would happen, but we just make it very explicit. Um, I'm not the right, if the RED will tell a funder that I'm not the right person to talk to. You need to talk to the people that are actually creating and doing this work.
And just to add to that, I think when you think of funders, the one thing that I find to be the most effective is building that relationship, whatever that means or whoever that is, and to really know about your funder and their philosophy and their approach, because we have funders in the field that are very progressive, that would find Sue's model to be innovative and something they want to support, and they would talk to anyone that that organization puts in front of them because they buy into that model, or they're looking for something innovative. But you have funders also who are very traditional, and they want the hierarchy, the top down kind of model. So I think it's really important to understand the funder that you're reaching out to, and kind of gauge how you want to approach them. If you want to go in full force with this decentralized model, non-traditional model, or do you want to kind of do the more traditional approach with the executive director as your kind of front person and then partnering with your program person. I think in the Bay Area, which is where I'm most familiar with the funders, some of our larger arts and cultural organizations are more innovative, and they would find something like that type of approach very intriguing. But I think there are some still in the area who might be a little shy or a little timid from supporting that type of model. But again, it's developing those relationships, and then that goes a long way into moving anyone in your direction.
Sorry, too many screens and lost my questions here. Something else we talked about was how the Sustainable Economies Law Center incubates projects so that their fundraising success is shared with either projects or organizations that might not have the same resources. So again, sort of Sue, I'd love your thoughts on this, and then Barbara, from your perspective, how that idea of incubating projects and sharing that success out to other organizations, a really community-centric approach looks like from your.
Absolutely. A lot of the projects that we incubate are either collaborations with other organizations and or projects that were started within the law center, but that want a little more autonomy. And so one of our sort of key projects is the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And because they are not a 501c3, many funders can't or won't fund them. Although our executive director Janelle Orsi would argue that they're doing charitable work that is very fundable by private and public foundations. And most folks, well, they want that 501c3 as the baseline for what they'll fund, and so we basically will sometimes apply for grants on their behalf, or any of our projects on their behalf. We keep our eyes open for funders who look like they might be a good fit for the incubated projects. We also apply for grants in coordination with the other organizations. And we also do different models of fiscal sponsorships for some of the other organizations. And then a part of the fiscal sponsorship agreement is an agreement about how we'll do fundraising together separately. We do ask the projects to let us know or give us a heads up if there's a funder that they're approaching, because we want to know if we already have a relationship that would be helpful, and or if we have an ask that we're either in the pipeline for or currently in talking to somebody about. So we do still kind of ask that the projects let us know what funding they're anticipating applying for. But often, like I said, it's either an application that they'll submit on and will act as fiscal sponsor for, or it may be joint fundraising, because a lot of the projects, you know, their work is achieving our mission, so we can co-apply, and we've gotten quite a good success with that, and it's allowed projects that maybe couldn't get in the door with some of the larger funders by themselves. And I think it's a great model for arts organizations and artists.
I'd love your thoughts on that and sort of how that fits into your larger equity grant making approach.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I don't think we pay enough attention to the organizations that serve that function that Sue has described, the incubator, the fiscal sponsorship. And I think there's this misconception that to be viable, you have to have a 501c3. And it's particularly in the Bay Area, where the cost of living and real estate is so high and the cost of doing business is so high, that we need to embrace kind of the non-traditional business models. And if that is a project that is fiscally sponsored, then that's the way to go. I always encouraged my grantees, especially the smaller entities, if they have a new project, that to work with it for a while before they consider a 501c3 status, just because it takes a lot of work. There's a lot of administrative needs that are required for that. And it takes you away from the programmatic elements. Normally, most people who start a nonprofit are mission driven anyway, so they don't generally have the administrative skills. So by them partnering with an entity like Sue's or other fiscal sponsors, that gives them the opportunity to really focus in on their mission. And then that administrative burden is carried by an entity that has the capacity and the resources to do that. I think that there's still some room within the philanthropic sector to fully embrace that. I think there's still this concern or fear that's to support fiscally sponsored projects means that they're not professional or they're not able to deliver. My hope is that that will change. And I think with this past year and the pandemic, that is shifting a lot of the ways that we not only function, but how philanthropic entities fund. And we've seen that, especially in this past year, of these small grassroots entities really moving the messages forward, and not needing that kind of traditional infrastructure. So, you know, that's the organizations that I traditionally have worked with are the small organizations that have very, very small budgets. We only funded entities that were under $1 million or $1.2 million, but they averaged under 100,000. And really working with the fiscal sponsor entities to really help pair them with projects. And that really leverages resources in a really efficient way, whether it's, as Sue was mentioning, you know, helping with the grant writing part, but there's also the models of like shared back office support where you can have shared meeting spaces. And that's something that's been really kind of on trend now, especially with space. You don't always need an office space 7 days a week. So to share that with someone else can really help stretch the budget and be more impactful. So I think there is, again, just like previous question, there are funders that understand that and embrace it and support it. And then there are those funders that still want that traditional 501c model. But I think as long as we keep pushing it, things will evolve and change.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that the Sustainable Economies Law Center hasn't operated as a traditional fiscal sponsor. These are really projects that we were co-collaborators with, that we wanted to see succeed, right? So we don't, you know, we're not out there looking for projects to support necessarily. These are actually projects that, if we could, we would do ourselves, right? That kind of thing. And that's stretching it a little bit. We don't have the expertise in some cases. For example, I put in or we want to partner with other organizations to do something. One good example of that is the Next Egg, which I put some links in the chat if people are interested in any of these projects. The Next Egg is a partnership between several organizations, Lift Economy, the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and some other folks that want to talk about retirement savings and getting our retirement savings off of Wall Street and into Main Street. Supporting people to invest their retirement savings in the projects they care about in their own neighborhoods. And that's something that we want to do nationwide. And so we partner with other organizations to get that work out into larger and different communities. So I guess I'm encouraging folks that are on the call to think about projects that maybe their organization isn't right to execute on, but that they really want to see in the world. Repaired Nations is another project that we support, and I put the link in there. And they are specifically working with folks in the African American community to support creating worker co-ops in the African American community. So it's not like a traditional fiscal sponsor. It really is about finding folks that are doing important work in your area of the sector and supporting them in that way.
I like how you posed that, Sue, how you said that you may not have the expertise. So how you are self-reflective and identify those areas that you may not be strong in, and how do you collaborate and identify partners to do that work, to incubate those projects. And I think that's an important point to make in expanding kind of the reach of nonprofits in that way.
And bringing those funding sources to parts of the community that might not normally have great connections. The Law Center's been successful for the last 10 years in establishing those relationships, and it's really part of our work to share that with others.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if either, this is open to the floor, but if either of you have had an experience where, you know, there's been a funder and a project and it's not necessarily been the best fit, and one organization introduces another that might have been a better fit. That kind of collaborative sharing of resources where you're saying, actually, this is who you should be talking to for this kind of work, and then making that connection. Is that something you've had experience with or seen in this work?
Absolutely. Like I said, we're often, well, so two things that happen that we have the advantage of doing is we have a public free legal cafe, I think we're up to like 3 or 4 times a month. It's almost weekly, where folks that have entrepreneurs, organizations that have ideas and need a little legal support can have a free consultation with a lawyer. Or a management professional if they're looking for like back end questions, rather than entity formation or that kind of thing. And a lot of great projects come through that. So that's one way. It's just like staying in touch with your community, whatever that public connection you have with your larger community. And then I'd say the other is, our grants team is often, always, I would say, looking at new funders, doing funder research. And when we see something that it's like, I don't think they fund us, or we don't want to do exactly what they're looking for, but XYZ would, they'd be great. This is the kind of work they want to do, and passing that information along, and maybe even introducing them to a program officer if that's appropriate.
Yeah, I find that my work a lot of the times is playing matchmaker. And you develop these partnerships and collaborations with the communities that you're working with. So you get to know their strengths and the areas of improvement. And it's always satisfying to be able to kind of fit those puzzle pieces together and introduce them to folks that they may not have necessarily thought would be a good partner. And kind of again, back to what Sue says, finding the folks with the strengths that you don't have. And sometimes it takes that kind of outsider view to see that happening. And I'm sure that there's been examples of those that haven't worked, but I've probably blocked them out of my mind, because partnerships don't always work. They don't. And I think it's also encouraging failure. And I think a lot of times the philanthropic sector doesn't embrace that, because you take a risk with a grantee, and you should embrace that and know that it's not always going to work, and be able to pivot and flex with that. And I think that is the way that I think philanthropy should be going into. And because that's the way we learn more by making mistakes than not. So yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that that maybe got a little easier during pandemic, is folks, like a lot of the business as usual didn't happen, and hopefully we don't have to go back to it completely. But that I think a lot of, at least more progressive funders, acknowledge that, like, now is the time. Actually, it's not the time to be more conservative. It's the time to actually get more folks out on the streets, doing the important work. So I think that we're still in a really opportune moment for folks to sort of expand their thoughts about what's possible and who should be doing this work. It's not just established 501c3 organizations, as we saw by the huge outpouring of mutual aid across the country and here in the Bay Area.
Yeah, and I think that sense of empathy that we've seen continues, and that is the way funding should be, with empathy, rather than going back to the old model of evaluative, quantitative and qualitative measures, and those types of things. And to be a good funder, you need to understand and have that dialogue, so that your grantees aren't afraid to talk to you about their challenges, and about their mistakes. And that takes time to build that trust and that relationship.
And I don't know, maybe Barbara, you can back me up on this, but I think that funders are becoming more aware of trusting folks in the community, because they acknowledge that in a lot of cases, and I'll venture to say most cases, the folks they're funding, they are not part of their community. So learning how to trust organizations and groups in the communities to do the work. And I think that's another service that TEL can provide, the Law Center can provide, is the funder will maybe we can lend some security or some tiny bit of reassurance to the funder that this is a project that maybe, though you've never heard of them, or maybe you don't understand quite what their community needs are, rather than waiting years to do a study, maybe we can just trust folks in the community to execute in the ways that will be most of service.
And I think as we talk about equity grant making or equity fundraising, that trust is a big cornerstone of that approach.
Barbara, I'm curious, you alluded to this in your introduction. If you can talk a little bit more about the equity grant making that you've overseen and developed in your work, what that looks like, and sort of what are some of the biggest learnings that you've taken from that?
Sure. Well, starting my philanthropy career in the social service sector, there's a lot of the equities built in about accessibility, supporting the most marginalized communities within our society. But when I started working at the San Francisco Arts Commission, what's unique about the funding there, the cultural equity grant making, is that was actually born from community advocacy. So as we know, the Bay Area is very politically charged, and the arts community felt that city funding was not going to the communities that most needed it. So it was a landmark legislation that passed this, that passed the cultural equity grant making, which requires the funding to go to a majority of minority communities. And what that meant at the time was the LGBT community, the disabled community, to women, and to African American, Asian American, Native American, or what we call BIPOC currently. And that was legislatively mandated. The crux of that, unfortunately, is that after that was passed in '93, we had Proposition 209 that also passed, that said public funding can't be determined on your class, or whether it's race, sexual orientation, or identity. So we had to be very creative about how we executed a grants program that was mandated to do one thing, but was illegal to do it at the same time. So, you know, I really looked to a study that talked about equity, that there are 3 pillars of equity, and we talk about accessibility, power shifting, and representation. And so that's how I kind of worked toward ensuring that we met our mandate by making the process as accessible as possible. And that meant either by the language that we used, or the actual mechanisms that we used, that we shifted power. So the funding recommendations were made by peers. So all of our panels were created by individuals in the community that mirrored our applicants. And then also representation, you know, making sure that who we're funding represented the people that we were supposed to fund, that our staff represented the communities that we were funding. But at the same time, as a government funder, there are just some things that, as much as I pushed, I couldn't quite get there. So we talk about trust. I could trust my grantees, but our auditors and controllers may not. So how do I bridge that? How do I translate or manipulate the information that would be accessible to my constituents, but then viable to kind of the oversight? So it was a very strange place to be in the middle of that kind of paradox. But as such, I mean, I had a great team that were all dedicated to the communities. My staff, each person represented multiple communities that we were supporting. So I think that was really important when we look at Sue's decentralized model, that my model of equity grant making, I relied on every member of my team to help guide the process, because I only have one lens that I'm looking through. So by having a team of 10, we had 10 different lenses that we looked through our process to really kind of tease it out and make sure that we're not inadvertently doing something that could harm or, you know, prevent one group that we're trying to support from being supported. And I think that is why Sue's model is so meaningful to me in that way, because I think when you're looking at equity, you have to look at a decentralized model. You can't be a hierarchy or siloed in that way. And, you know, through that work, we were able to, the majority, our grant making went from serving about 50 to 60% people that we were targeting that were considered marginalized communities, up to 80%. So just in every cycle, we would stop, we would review what we did, we would do kind of a plus delta. We would engage our constituents in helping us identify kind of areas that we could improve upon. And every year we just continued to work towards something better. And another thing is that, you know, communities, they shift, we're not static. And 25 years ago, when the legislation was first created, it didn't reflect the communities that are now marginalized too. So things like the Arab American communities, they weren't specifically identified. So we had to shift with that as well and be open and flexible to how we as a society evolve. So that's another component, I think, of equity, is that flexibility, and always questioning, always, you know, you're always learning. It's not a one-off in equity. You have to continuously work toward it.
I'm curious, Barbara, looking now as we're coming out of the pandemic, and this is you're in a different role. What are you looking to funders who are approaching equity grant making now? What would you like to see funders building on in the work that you did?
Well, I think what we're seeing, you know, equity is now a buzzword. It's trendy. What equity is trendy. So you have a lot of, whether it's funders or arts organizations who are being performative in their approach to equity. They may have an equity statement, or they may, have a Black Lives Matter statement. But what really matters is what's happening behind the doors to make that a reality. And we've seen a lot of that, I think, especially through this past year with all the Black Lives Matter movements that are taking place, that a lot of our cultural institutions that hadn't authentically worked in that kind of realm jump on that bandwagon, but then they were doing things that they were not informed, they were not skilled, they didn't understand how to navigate those communities because they didn't have the infrastructure for it. So it was performative and it wasn't effective. It was actually damaging. So I think with funders are becoming more savvy too about what equity is. So when they're looking to fund organizations that have that equity value system, they're going to be looking much deeper than the surface or the performative. They're going to want to know that your staff is inclusive and diverse, but also that they have a voice, and that the constituents that the organization is working with is truly and authentically embedded. It's not doing it for them, it's doing with and by them. So I think that arts organizations need to evolve with the time in that way and really look at the way they approach equity to make sure that they are truly embedding it deeply into their organization, and it's not just a performative statement or a program that features an artist of color, that it's actually community driven and led and embedded.
Yeah, and I would say not that shared governance is automatically equitable, but at least it gives us a framework in which to achieve equity, because power imbalances will happen regardless of your structure, but the structure doesn't support the power imbalance, right? So the hierarchy itself, to me, supports an inequitable situation for workers and for constituents, right? We talk a really good game about equity in our communities, but then we look at our organizations and there's no equity. There's a highly paid people at the top two tiers, and then there's the folks, especially in frontline organizations, that are making maybe minimum wage. And how can we talk about equity when that's the state of the workers in our organization? So I'm a more flat organization and a more flat pay scale is gonna tell me a lot more about an organization's equitable work than anything on their mission statement or on their About Us page.
In keeping with this organic conversation, I'm actually going to pull in a question from the audience right now that came up because it ties in really well. Flipping the coin a little bit, we had an audience member ask, in what ways can grantees look for equity-based grant opportunities? So how can organizations initiate a conversation with funders who aren't necessarily thinking about equity or reflecting that in their grant making?
Oh, go ahead, Sue. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, and maybe you can answer my question to that, which is, are there funders that aren't, at least, like you said, on the surface talking about equity right now? I mean, I would find that hard to believe. So I think it's more about holding people's, walking the talk than discovering them. It's much more about like having these conversations about what truly is equitable.
And I think specifically around how do you approach funders, that could be tricky, depending on what type of funder they are. If they're a public funder, they are supposed to answer their constituents. The constituency should be able to voice concerns or ask those questions and be heard. Whether or not that always happens is another story. With private foundations, they tend to have more flexibility to navigate changes than a public funder does. But then you have to be careful about the relationship that you're building with them, because they don't have to fund you. So it is a act of diplomacy and the art of communication and how you address those questions and who you're addressing them to. Because again, everything is relational. And if you build a positive, healthy relationship, your message is going to go further. So I would agree with Sue. I think right now, I mean, it is on everyone's radar, equity, but whether or not they understand what equity truly is a different story. But yeah, you just have to be careful about who you're approaching and how you're approaching them to have those conversations.
And I would, I think you said this earlier, but I'll say it in another way, Barbara, is that as well as encouraging funders to walk their talk, we have to walk our talk, right? So the things that the projects that we're putting forward and the other organizations that we're supporting, how do we talk about them, and how are they truly being equitable, and how are they great projects, right? I mean, nothing's changed just in this word of equity. We also have to talk about and like you said, good communication about the effectiveness and the need, right? It's not it's not changed, even though we can talk about it amongst communities that maybe aren't used to, that the funder's not used to approaching.
Thank you both. It's interesting. This is something I feel like a principle in community-centric fundraising and in treating donors as partners and how you navigate those conversations. I think you both just said it well in terms of just diplomacy but also transparency, and occasionally having challenging conversations where you're trying to further their understanding of what equity-based work. Is that a situation that either of you have faced from either perspective? I know both of you have been on sort of both sides of this coin of the fundraiser or the grant maker. And so, you know, where you've had to have a difficult conversation with a donor and how you approach that to, you know, with diplomacy and also transparency.
I can say that I've had a lot of those challenging conversations with my grantees, especially in the public sector. I've learned a lot from my grantees. And it is how, you know, working in the public sector is an exercise of humility a lot of times. And being able to be open to criticism and take it and take that information and make it effective and impactful. And some of the grantees that I've had that have been the most vocal when I started actually became my biggest supporters and the ones that I supported the most toward the end, because they had something valuable to say and I was open to it. And I respected them for it and I valued them for it as we move forward. And I think that is like where equity and that partnership and communication comes into play, that I tried to foster an environment not just for my team, but for our constituents to be able to come to me if they had a challenge with what we were doing. And as such, whenever I made changes, those were generally the people that I would reach out to engage, to have that conversation about the impact of those changes. So I think, as Sue was saying, you know, we have to have those difficult conversations. I think that is hopefully one of the lessons we're learning this past year, is that we grow through discomfort. And the conversations we've been having are not ones that we've been having before, at least not on a open, wider front. It's usually been in our respective communities we're having some of these conversations. So that is something I think as a funder, was a big lesson for me that I embrace, is being able to have a positive outcome from something that may have been contentious or critical in the beginning. And that doesn't always work. I'm human. So, I try my best, but yeah, those happen. Those just, uncomfortable conversations, especially when you're talking about race and equity, and, all of those things that we're dealing with.
I don't remember what the original question is, but here we go. I guess I would also just encourage us to have those difficult conversations within our organizations, because if we're not having them within our organizations, we're not having them with funders, or we're having them, like you said, we're doing lip service to them, right? So if we're not having them with each other as coworkers, as colleagues, it's gonna, and the reverse, right? If we are having them, they're gonna naturally come into the conversations with the rest of our community.
I always take the marketing adage that your team, your coworkers reflect what the community thinks of you. So if your coworkers are disgruntled or feeling that they're being prejudiced against, or that the environment itself is not fostering that, then that is generally what the larger community views your organization as. So you start internally and you work out, and that's a lot of the work that we did at the Arts Commission around racial equity started internally, and that we made great strides through that. When I started there, I had a conversation, and some of my coworkers didn't know what a microaggression was, to then going through multiple trainings where they were fully understood it, were like the biggest allies of communities of color by after a couple of years, but through that process. So we made quite an evolution by having those really hard conversations internally.
And I would go back to that word transparency too. If there's not transparency around the financial workings of your organization internally, how much financial transparency is there to your community? For example, and this is always, like, I'm just going to throw it out there because it always makes people have an opinion, but everybody at the law center knows what everybody else makes. It's completely public knowledge. And how we got there is a joint decision by the whole staff. We do a participatory budgeting process every year, so that the whole staff gets to help decide how general operating support gets spent. Financial transparency at all levels is kind of what I believe in.
Building on that a little bit, this is something that I've run into a lot with my work with, I work with institutional funders, communicating to funders how much things cost, how much overhead goes into things. A lot of funders will often have a cap on, we'll only allow 10% of overhead included in this grant, or 12% of overhead included in this grant. One of the sort of another principle around community-centric fundraising and thinking about these collaborative and transparent practices is communicating how much things cost, how much our time is worth. I don't have a very specific question, but I'm curious on your thoughts on how we can be communicating that to funders, and again, what are, from a grant making perspective, what that looks like.
Those are great points. I think the Nonprofit Finance Fund came out with a study around right sizing your project, or the true cost of projects. And I see it time and time again when applicants try to do too much within what they're doing, thinking that gives them a competitive edge. And sometimes it may, because you have to do a lot of educating, not only for our program, for our panelists too, who who were also coming from that same kind of mentality of doing more for less, or we have to wear all of these hats and do as much as we can. And I think the larger funders get that probably better than the smaller funders as to the right size of an ask. And I think ultimately, if you articulate what you're trying to accomplish and look at depth, not breadth, that generally the larger funders will understand that. But it may again be the articulation of that argument to really get that point across. And I'd rather see a project where the people involved are getting paid a living wage than having them serve 1,000 more people, you know. But that was kind of the value system that we placed in our grant making. But I've had panelists who've reviewed grant applications and compared to, for the same amount of money, where one was doing twice as much as the other, but the one that was doing less was doing it deeper and from my perspective, a better quality, but they were stuck on the quantity, not the quality in that sense. So there's some education to do on people who are involved in those decision-making processes.
Barbara, we just had a request in the chat for that study about the true cost of projects. I don't know if you can throw that in the chat, or we can look that up as well.
I'll see if I can find it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just build on what Barbara was just saying. One of my mentors, Jan Masaoka, who was the executive director at Compass Point when I worked there, used to say, instead of doing more with less, how about if we just do more with more, right? So that and somewhat I like to think about that as like it is a shift in mindset. It is like we're not. It's a little bit of confidence in our actual work, like and I think the title of today's talk is perfect. Like we're not fighting to the death here. We are doing important work, and it needs to be done. And unfortunately, at this point in our evolution, the government is not funding the needs of our communities, right? And foundations are clearly the place with. I mean, I think our government should be funding more of our community's needs, and we probably all agree with that. But that there is a role for funders to do that, and we're not asking for a favor here. We're asking to do exactly what they say they're going to do, which is support the communities by which they acquired this wealth, or you know, on a private foundation basis, or as they're serving their communities in a public foundations. So that confidence of the quality of our work and the need for our work.
The Nonprofit Finance Fund does a lot of work around that, like what it actually takes to fully capitalize an organization, to get them off the ground and sustainable. So there's a lot of research around that too, how to do that.
Building on that a little bit, thinking about need, I have another question from the audience here, asking if you could both expand a little bit more on the shift of trust from funders deciding what a community might need to relying on community leaders to guide them to the areas most in need. So how has this manifested recently in funding, and how funders are approaching their philanthropy, and where do you see this going in the future?
I think it goes back to lip service again. I think we can say that trust and community embeddedness is a cornerstone, a foundation of equity, but when funders actually start trying to put that in practice, they realize how much time and resource it takes, because it takes time to build relationships and trust. And I don't think in our society, we're not, those values aren't supported. It's always fast, quick, hurry. It's never about, let's take a year or two just to get to know each other, understand each other, and support one another in an authentic way. Generally with large funders, their strategic plan is 3 to 5 years, and they're on to something else. So I think we still have a long way to go to really truly embed that kind of community engagement and trust building into the work that we do. And I don't think it's just at the funder level. I think it's within nonprofits, within collaboration with one another, because it's hard work. It's messy work, to be that embedded in community, and then also how to decentralize the control of resources, and that power dynamic that takes place. And I don't think we've, Sue's model is working in that direction, but I think in general society they don't know how to function in that way. It's so embedded in us to be top down, capitalist driven. So I'm really excited. I hope that this past year has really pushed the needle in that way. But I don't know. I don't know that once the pandemic is over and things are back to normal, if that'll be a practice that continues, because it is a lot of work. I don't know, what does Sue think about that?
I just sparking on things that you mentioned, which is, instead of insisting that the funder be embedded in the community, what if we just trust the community? And like I said, I think that's one of the roles that I think the Law Center has played, is be like, no, actually, you should trust these people. You know, um, the the metrics that you talked about, and the more and the faster, quicker, more mentality is to just continue to confront that, of like, we can actually trust these people that are in this community, to be responsible with your money.
Mhm.
And that you don't have to like embed in order to actually find trustworthy projects to fund.
Mhm.
Um,
And there are
that's
fun.
what
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Sue. Sorry.
no that's what just sparked my mind from what you just said, Barbara.
And there are kind of new models that are out there. Edgar Villanueva just came out with Decolonizing Wealth, and the Liberated Capital Fund that he's doing, and working in the philanthropic sector to kind of push that understanding of trust, and putting that power decision making in the hands of community. And I think that's pushing the needle in a lot of ways. With Ford Foundation is kind of latched onto that and changing some of their perspectives around funding, especially Black and Indigenous communities. So there is some hope. But yes, as Sue said, that that embeddedness is another level. So that trust, you don't need to truly be embedded to have trust. You should understand communities and have relationships with community. And quite frankly, it is hard to be embedded in a community and funding that same community, because it creates a lot of layers of dynamics that are really, really challenging to navigate.
Another question that just came in, and I think this came in 2 parts, so hopefully I'm asking this correctly. And if I'm not anonymous attendee, please jump back in there and correct me. Somebody asked about how can we work to get leadership in an organization on board to start thinking of more community-centric fundraising ideas and collaborative approaches. And I think that this ties into something we talked about, which is, how can a formal development team start integrating a more decentralized model into their work, incorporating more folks across the organization?
Yeah, I think if there's not like overall institutional support for a less hierarchical organization, we encourage teams to try to implement a more peer-based model within whatever size team they have, whether that would be how your meeting structures are, making sure that everybody truly has a voice, even in your team meeting. For example, we go around in multiple circles, and making sure everybody is consciously participating, passing or objecting, right? So that there's no like meeting that doesn't happen in the round for us, so that everybody in the meeting has a voice. And the structure of the meeting is built. It's built into the structure that everybody has a voice. So I'd say if a development team wants to try to think about more equity just amongst themselves, like do the management positions truly have more power? So it probably is going to take somebody in the hierarchy to be on board with this. But at whatever level you have buy-in, start there, and you know, and then that's one way in, is that we have to demonstrate that this can work at whatever level we started at.
So we had another follow-up question that actually dovetails well there. We're doing well on this. If you could elaborate a little bit on the participatory budgeting and decision-making at the Law Center. Any practical advice for nonprofits trying to start practices like this? I can read questions.
Yeah, the process is still pretty new for us. This is our second budgeting year of doing it, and basically what we've done is that anybody from the organization can make a proposal to spend any surplus or any or decide the way that allocated funds could be spent. And then we, as a whole staff, vote on a slate of those proposals, and we do a high ask, an ask of like, okay, this would fully fund it, and this is the minimum that we need to maintain this project or to start this project, kind of thing. I can look for some other resources around participatory budgeting. There's an organization called the Community Democracy Project here in Oakland that's actually trying to get the city of Oakland to do participatory budgeting, and they have some resources. And I think that quite soon the Law Center will be putting out a little more information through our worker self-directed nonprofits around participatory budgeting. But maybe we can follow up. If there's follow-up resources, I can look for some.
Definitely something we can do. I'll can start adding some things to our events page. And then everybody just watch the Sustainable Economies Law Center, I think. Oop. I'm curious, another question that just came in is, do you anticipate any long-term negative effects on funding? I think specifically equity funding because of COVID-19. We've talked about some of the opportunities that this last year has opened. Do you think there are any downsides?
I think it depends on the organization. And I've seen organizations that were undercapitalized, underfunded prior to COVID that are now, getting money thrown at them. And generally that's Black or Indigenous organizations that are serving around the conversations we've been having this past year. I know within my new organization, that's been the case. It hasn't, the funding hasn't subsided. It's actually been more interest in the organization now because of the constituency that we support. But I don't think that's true for everyone. I think that it has definitely impacted, just for arts organizations specifically, with the inability to even do programming, which of course adversely affects the ability to get funding. And again, I think as much funding that was going out there to support organizations like that, the arts are always underfunded regardless. So people were struggling around that. So I don't know, I have hopes that we're going to be entering into a more fruitful period. But again, I think it'll be targeted to specific, unfortunately, it'll be targeted to the check boxes where funders can have the lip service to say, I did my part. Hopefully it's more authentic than that, but that's probably more of the reality.
Yeah, I don't think I know what the answer to this question is, or even what I've thought about it. I'm certainly hoping that that the funders that have stepped up during COVID will continue, but I do have a lot of fear about returning to normal, whatever that is, and the idea of you know, face-to-face services or in-person services, and forgetting what it's like to provide them. Or not forgetting, but like the need's going to always be there, and as we come out of this, it's going to look different. Like most of us have maintained our spaces, and it's going to take quite an adjustment to all of us going back to work in an office. I think. What can we do to support each other? I know I'm not ready.
We just had a bunch of questions dropped in. I'm going to start with the first one because it's really
I see that
big.
Sal is asking lots of interesting questions.
But I also really want to know the answer to the first one of this. So we'll start there. If there were no limits, what would your radical vision of funding be?
That's a hard one, but my first reaction is funding that is driven by community, that it's not funders making those decisions, it's community making those decisions. And that organizations or the recipients of that funding are fully funded. It's not it's not the piecemeal small grants. It's actually general operating grants that sustain an organization, that really impact an organization. My hesitation with that, though, is that if something happens and this is my radical vision, so the funding would never disappear. So I was just going to say, if the funding disappears and you have an organization that has been reliant upon that money for a while, and it's hard to pivot. But yeah, I would like to see organizations more fully capitalized, and that those organizations are supported by community in those decision making.
Oh, geez, this is a big question, but off the top of my head, I'd say payout limits should be higher for private foundations. 5% is not enough. I think that the whole concept of donor advised funds should be brought into question, and maybe time limits, or the payout being within a donor's lifetime. I don't know. Inherited wealth is not sustainable for the planet as far as I'm concerned. So we need to, and that the government should be paying for services, and hence tax reform in a huge way. Probably repeal Prop 13 for here in California for corporations. Those are three ideas I can throw out right away.
Love this radical visioning. I want to keep going and then turn it into the way it is. I'm curious, thinking about museums, since a lot of the folks here tonight with us are from museums of all shapes and sizes around the Bay Area. What do you think museums are a good place to start testing these different models? And do you think we should be striving for mixed revenue models, so earning revenue through admission and events? I'm curious sort of your perspective on museums as people who are operating outside of them.
I know we have folks on here from the Oakland Museum, and I have to give a shout out to my cohort who's on here from the John F. Kennedy School for Museum Studies, which was a model that we looked at that was looking at more of a decentralized leadership model. I would beg to ask them what their perspective is on how that worked, because we studied the evolution or the beginning of that. So how, if it was effective, I don't know. But I'm a big fan of diversified revenue as a funder. I think that helps organizations withstand economic booms and busts. And what we've seen is the organizations that are more flexible in that way have been able to withstand this period of time. And the organizations that have been creative in their programming, that's not necessarily tied to a building, is important to currently. But yeah, definitely diversified revenue. As much as you can do to diversify it, the better.
I think Sue's moving inside, Barbara. She's left us.
It's cold. She left me. Oh no.
Don't worry, everyone. She'll come back. She warned us that this might happen. I'm curious, Barbara, looking at, there we go.
She's back. Yay.
This is the moving cultural connections program, everyone.
Right,
we've decided
Mobile.
that static webinars are we're all over it. It's been over a year. So now we move. Sue, do you want to take a crack at that question now that you're inside and hopefully warmer?
Yes, if you remind me of the question now that I'm warmer.
We were talking about what your thoughts are on diversified funding models for museums. So mixed revenue model or other organizations. So mixed revenue models from earned revenue and admissions, and balancing that with contributed revenue. And I'm curious if you have a perspective on that from the Law Center.
Yeah, I think that we would always strive to have more earned revenue, but we also really strive to make our programs available to everybody who needs them. And so again, it's more of a conversation with users of our services about what is a fair price for this while you consider your position within the community. We have folks that come to our legal cafes that can afford nothing, and we have folks that come to our legal cafes that know that if they want a service outside of this model that is given freely, that it would cost them $200 or $400 an hour to talk to an attorney. So just making that having some awareness amongst the community in terms of earned revenue. And we also have a really diverse and large individual donor program. And some of those folks give $5 a month and some give a lot more. And so just continuing to have connections with the community around supporting the organization. But the bulk of our funding is still through foundations.
That actually pins well to another question that just came in from an attendee who said that they're struggling to find a balance between engaging with high-level donors who love the exclusivity of galas, but rarely engage with us during the rest of the year, versus supporters who aren't able to make very large financial contributions, but are really plugged into our programming year-round. Do you have any advice for nonprofits looking to pivot away from a reliance on seasonal fundraising galas towards a more inclusive fundraising model or fundraising events?
Well, I guess I would ask, what have we learned this year since you haven't been able to have those events? Is that support still there? I don't know. We rely less and less on events as a fundraising model, and more in just doing great programming. Although we did quite a few like sort of online weeks of programming via Zoom that we were able to gain support. We also see our weeks, like some of the virtual events and actual programming this year, as an excuse to reach out to institutional givers as well. But I also have a mentor at that funding always follows programs. So the folks that care about your programs should care about your programs regardless of the gala, I hope. I don't know. I'm not, I don't know, what do other people think about that?
I think what you said, Sue, is important, that especially as we look this past year where we couldn't have those events, and how have we survived without them. And that's maybe part of what not going back to normal should look like. And I think that might also be an opportunity to talk about equity with your funders, and if galas are really supporting those values of equity, if that's what they're at least saying that they're supporting, because those are also very inaccessible to the community. So how do you change that conversation, or how do you pivot? I mean, some or entities may like the galas. I know some folks really enjoy those and they live for those things. But if that is not the desire of the organization, we talk about mission drift too. And if that is not part of your value system, then you need to question whether or not you continue that. And if you can have that conversation with your funder to help pivot them to support your value system. I mean, and I think as we evolve, society evolves, and I think that kind of generation of gala goers may not be as predominant. I know there's a lot, we have to look at the younger generation, the millennials and younger, of like what really engages them, and that changes, that shifts. So yeah, I think it'll evolve naturally.
We just have a few more minutes, and I realize I've been talking to all of you for a while, but Barbara and Sue, this has been wonderful. I mean, we've touched on a lot of different things. I just wanted to ask if there was anything else that, we've talked a lot about sort of visions for what equity grant making could look like, and equity funding, and how we can have these conversations internally as well as with our donors. Is there anything else that we didn't touch on tonight that you'd like to share? Any things that have worked really well in your work around promoting these kinds of conversations, or any takeaways that we haven't touched on? It can be, we can have covered it, but I just wanted to open the floor since we've bopped around a lot.
I think if I was to give advice to an organization, kind of in relation to what we were just talking about, is embracing the authentic self of the organization. And as Sue put it, if you have programs, the funding will come. And I think if you're authentic and you're doing exactly what your mission is and what your community wants you to do, then you'll be supported. And so that would be what I would leave everyone with, in that sense, that don't be afraid to not conform. In that sense, as long as you're serving community the way that the community wants it to happen, then I think you're doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Thanks, Barbara.
Take it home, Sue. Give us one of your wisdom, your grain of wisdom there.
I mean, I guess I just go back to what I said earlier, which is how do we structure ourselves so that everyone has a voice? And that's truly supporting a collective rather than a hierarchy. And that goes for internal within your organization and with the communities that you're efforting to serve.
Thank you both. I really enjoyed it. I hope everybody else did too. We've gotten a lot of snaps in the chat box over here. Thank you so much for your time this evening, for thinking through some radical visioning of what funding and fundraising can look like. And we're excited for the future. So I think we'll need to put together some of these resources. So I will start working on collecting those, and everybody look out for more things on participatory budgeting from the Sustainable Economies Law Center. And thank you, Barbara and Sue, for your time, your expertise, and your perspective tonight.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
And enjoyable conversation. Thank you, Barbara and Madeline both, and everybody who watched.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.